Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 4, Episode 7, A City of Ash. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Last time, we saw the Great Fire of London burn the heart out of England's capital city. Starting with a simple house fire in the home of a baker, Thomas Fariner, the flames spread from Pudding Lane, fanned by a strong breeze and fuelled by the dry timbers of a sun-baked city. The fire burned for 4 days, from early on Sunday morning until the evening of Wednesday, before finally the wind dropped, and fire breaks starved it of fuel. The core of London was the City of London, a distinct area of the city, governed by a corporation and led by an elected mayor and common council. The city was surrounded by the old Roman walls, but it held jurisdiction over most of the suburbs which would one day become Greater London. Within those walls was a complex maze of streets and lanes which had developed over centuries of residence, and as the city grew, the demand to make more of the space grew with it. This led to cramped, narrow gaps between built-up tenements, with upper floors sticking out to make more space. This was especially the case nearer the walls and the Thames, where poorer Londoners tended to live. Though wealthier Londoners did build their homes out of brick and stone, most were still made of timber and wattle. The City of London was a highly developed, wealthy heartland of commerce and trade. The city's guilds were some of the oldest in the kingdom, and its docks were a bustling hub of ships and ferries coming and going. It was this core which was ravaged by the Great Fire. 3/4 of the city within the walls was destroyed by fire, as was a decent chunk outside the western walls. Only the eastern quarter, which included Samuel Pepys' house and the Tower of London, with its huge stock of gunpowder, escaped destruction, and only because of good luck and the hard work of thousands of people. Right, let's put some numbers to the carnage. A total of 87 churches were partly or wholly destroyed by the fire. The first had been St. Magnus the Martyr, Thomas Fariner's parish church. The largest was, of course, St. Paul's Cathedral, which collapsed and destroyed all the precious papers stored in its crypts. Several of the city's most prestigious buildings went up in smoke. The Royal Exchange, the Customs House, Baynard's Castle, they were all destroyed. Even the Guildhall was heavily damaged. Cheapside, home of goldsmiths and silk sellers for centuries, was levelled. Of London's 51 livery company halls, 40 of them had been burned. And of course, in between all those famous landmarks were thousands of buildings. Tenements, flats, rooms, inns, grand houses, small hovels, hospitals, almshouses, warehouses, all home to people of every class and profession. In all, more than 13,000 houses, around 15% of London's homes, were destroyed in the fire, which left at least 70,000, and maybe over 100,000 people homeless. The stretch between Fleet Street and the Tower of London was a wasteland of ash, smouldering timbers, and crumbled stone. One contemporary claimed you could see from one side to the other. Everything in between had been levelled. London was more like a field, if you ignored all the wreckage and the city's many cellars and basements and vaults. Many of those were still burning, even when the rest of the inferno had died, like smouldering pits. Later reports put the total cost of the fire at £10 million. But what about deaths? Despite the enormous scale of destruction, the number of people killed is tiny. The official tally was 6. The first being the Fariner's maid, who was too scared to escape the burning bakery. But the real number of deaths is almost certainly much higher. People whose deaths went unmarked and unrecorded, suffocating in cellars or trapped in burning buildings. And of course, the intense heat in parts of the inferno was more than high enough to cremate any human remains, leaving little for searchers to find, even if they were looking. Some scholars suggest the true number of fire deaths could be more than 100, but we have little evidence for them. The greater number of deaths came from much less dramatic causes. From among those tens of thousands of refugees, many of whom had nowhere to live and nothing to their names. It will take time to rebuild, and it is only September. A long autumn and winter awaits. Exposure will claim many lives, but even accounting for these, the death toll from the Great Fire of London is shockingly low. It could have easily been much worse if the wind had been a little stronger. Similar infernos in similarly enormous cities like Constantinople in the Ottoman Empire or Edo in Japan had tens of thousands of deaths just from the flames. Still, that would be small comfort to those now huddled in the fields and suburbs of London without a penny to their name, staring down the cold seasons. Once the fire was mostly out, Charles II sent new orders to Lord Mayor Thomas Bloodworth. Public order was one of the king's chief priorities. His brother, James, Duke of York, was commanding the militia, and the Duke of Albemarle, George Monk, would arrive on the 7th of September with a force of regulars. But city government needed to be visible. Bloodworth assembled London's aldermen at Gresham College, and these men, merchant princes of a burned-out city, set to work. First, they wanted to restart trade. Markets were quickly established around the ruins of the city centre, at Tower Hill, Smithfield, Leadenhall Street and Bishopsgate Street. Trade returned very quickly, and well-needed food and supplies flowed to the ruined city. Fire wardens were appointed to monitor the smouldering ruins and ensure that the flames didn't catch once again. And something had to be done about the tens of thousands of refugees scattered around the suburbs. They needed feeding, and they needed housing. Canvas, originally bound for the navy to make sails, was redirected to Moorfields and sewn into tents. Ship's biscuit, which Fariner had been baking the day of the fire, was also redistributed to the desperate. The rubble around London Bridge was ordered cleared, and sheds and tents were erected to provide shelter. Internationally, the public response from Paris was one of complete sympathy and horror at this disaster. France had entered the Anglo-Dutch War on the side of the Netherlands, but Louis XIV ordered that there be no celebration that their enemy's capital city burned to the ground. He gave his condolences to his aunt, Dowager Queen Henrietta Maria, who was in France, and he offered to send food to the stricken metropolis. Which is all lovely. Except it was a complete fib. Louis was thrilled at the news. As we'll cover next week, it hadn't been a good year for the French Navy, and if the rumours were true, the English had lost their entire stock of naval supplies in the fire. This fire might have just won the war for the French and the Dutch. Unfortunately for the French king, those particular rumours were not true. The Dutch response was similar, although the press more openly relished in the fire. As we'll also see next week, the Royal Navy had struck a fiery blow against Dutch merchant shipping just weeks earlier, so this seemed like divine retribution. The Earl of Sandwich, serving as ambassador to Spain, worked hard to downplay the damage. All the wealth of the city had been saved, the military supplies were untouched, and only houses and unimportant buildings had been destroyed. A good mix of truth and untruth, as befits a diplomat. In October, Charles announced a kingdom-wide charity drive and called on his subjects to donate what they could to help the needy. Parishes across England and Wales donated £16,487 over the 10 years the drive lasted. There was also substantial aid from the colonies. New England was particularly active, with preachers like Increase Mather and John Davenport calling on their flocks to aid Old England. Charitable contributions came in from across the three kingdoms, particularly from Colchester. Colchester had been utterly ravaged by the plague, and the City of London had been very generous in sending aid. This generosity was now returned. This money was used to buy food and build quick shelters for the needy. These charitable contributions were distributed with surprisingly little corruption. Bloodworth's successor as mayor would be hounded from office, partly because of suspicions that he'd skimmed from the fund. Nearby towns and villages provided food to feed the many thousands of refugees, and these communities also took in many people, particularly those who could pay for a roof and a bed. The Lord Deputy of Ireland, the Duke of Ormond, sent an offer of 20,000 cattle to help feed the devastated city, which is quite generous. But Ormond's offer ran into two obstacles: personal politics in the Restoration Court and economics. Economically, the offer of Irish cattle threatened English farmers, particularly in Western England and Wales. In the Stuart Court, Ormond and the Earl of Clarendon were the enemies of the rising Duke of Buckingham and the future Earl of Shaftesbury. When the House of Commons debated the matter, the two factions used the Irish Cattle Bill of 1666 as their battlefield, and, as part of a wider turn against Ormond and Clarendon, the Cattle Bill was defeated and the import of Irish cattle rejected. The hysteria which had gripped the refugees, that the fire was deliberate arson carried out by foreign spies, hadn't gone away. Instead, it had spread, ironically not helped by the paralysis in communication. With the fire, the London Gazette had ceased production, and most of the printing presses used by the state were either destroyed or unavailable. For many outside of London, they received reports of a fire before the capital suddenly went silent, with ominous smoke on the horizon. Had London been completely destroyed? All across England, town councils and local lords began to prepare for the next shoe to drop. Surely this had just been the first part of a larger attack, clearing the ground for an invasion or rebellion. On the Isle of Wight, armed guards were placed on the docks, and Dutch and French people in Norwich and King's Lynn were arrested. At Hull, foreigners were detained and placed under heavy guard. The Earl of Carlisle sent out the trained bands to secure the county of Cumberland, just in case the Dutch or French invaders arrived in northwest England. In a war with the French and Dutch, it's easy to see how rumours could spring up and take on a life of their own. Foreign residents, or in the language of the time, aliens, normally only suffered a few nights in jail before cooler heads prevailed, but not always. There was vigilante violence, as people who looked or sounded foreign were beaten up in London and other cities. But the worst case that we know of wasn't ordinary people taking matters into their own hands, but the justice system killing a completely innocent man. Robert Hubert, or is it Hubert, a French watchmaker, had been en route to Rouen when his ship was detained by the Royal Navy. When he tried to leave the country later, he was arrested at Romford in Essex. He was questioned, and under pressure, Hubert confessed to throwing a fireball in Westminster. That was enough for the authorities to order him transferred to the Old Bailey, and he went on trial in October. On the stand, he confessed to being part of a Catholic and/or French conspiracy, and that he'd actually thrown his fireball through the window of Thomas Farriner's bakery. Under guard, he was taken to Pudding Lane, or what was left of it, and told to point to the site of Farriner's bakery, which he did. The jury found him guilty, and the judge sentenced him to death. After claiming he was Catholic, he received absolution from the Queen's confessors, and then he was hanged. If that all sounds hard to believe or a bit too tidy, that's because it's nonsense. Hubert was, in the language of the time, slow or simple-minded. His interrogator in Essex asked him leading questions in a language which he may not have been entirely fluent in, and then the interrogators in London did the same, while correcting his earlier mistake, since the fire hadn't started in Westminster, and Westminster had actually been untouched. He was taken to Pudding Lane, and he correctly identified the bakery. But he lived in London before the fire, and since the fire, Farriner's Bakery had become very well known. The jury also had to ignore the testimony and evidence of Hubert's fellow travellers, including the ship's captain. He testified that Hubert hadn't even left the ship until the fire had already been raging for 2 days. And finally, Hubert was Protestant, not Catholic. Whether his request for a Catholic confessor was down to confusion, getting executed is stressful, or because the authorities preferred Hubert to be Catholic to better fit the story, we don't know. Whatever the reason, people needed a scapegoat, and so Hubert died for a crime he did not and could not have committed. The correlation of the Great Fire and the end of serious plague outbreaks in London has sometimes led to the belief that it was the fire which burned away the infested buildings of London. A cleansing flame which left the capital in ashes, but meant that the plague rats had nowhere to live. But Allinson and Dorothy Moot, among others, argue that this is just a myth, pointing out that most of the destruction was in the wealthy centre of the city, which left the bulk of the poorer, unhealthy neighbourhoods untouched. Instead, they argue that the drop in plague deaths was more the changing of behaviour, both of individuals, who began changing their clothes and bedding more often, as well as architects and builders, who started constructing even the poorest houses in brick rather than wattle, as well as the disappearance of thatched roofs. Both factors left rats, plague rats or otherwise, with fewer places to live. Speaking of architects, let's talk about the rebuilding of London. On the 13th of September 1666, Charles issued a proclamation that a survey would be taken of the destroyed city to ensure that property rights would be respected. If you had owned land before the fire, you would still own it. Ownership would be confirmed by an Act of Parliament, and anyone who built or otherwise infringed upon someone else's property would be punished. The proclamation also stated that the rebuilt buildings would be made of brick and stone, streets would be widened, and narrow alleys kept to a minimum. These measures would reduce the spread of fire and make it easier to move fire engines around the city. There were many proposals for how to rebuild the City of London, and it's a sign of the growing interest in cartography and architecture in Restoration England, which is perhaps best illustrated by the newly founded Royal Society. We will see a lot more of the Royal Society in the future. 3 of the leading proposals for the rebuilding came from fellows of the Society: Christopher Wren, Robert Hooke, and John Evelyn. Even before the ash had cooled, on the 10th of September, Christopher Wren presented his plan for the rebuilt City of London to the King. Wren imagined a new city of uniform streets and wide avenues, all leading to the rebuilt St. Paul's Cathedral. He was still in charge of repairing that, after all. The north bank of the Thames was to be cleared, and the narrow River Fleet was to be widened into a canal. Wren was Deputy Surveyor of His Majesty's Works, so this was kind of his job, but his fellows in the Royal Society were absolutely livid. The Society was still new, and this was a good opportunity to prove their usefulness and relevance. But here was Wren, bypassing them altogether and going straight to the King. Wren later apologised, explaining that he had rushed to submit his proposal before anyone else submitted theirs, which, as far as Evelyn and Hooke were concerned, was exactly the problem. Evelyn submitted his proposal on the 13th of September, and he came at it from a similar angle to Wren. Evelyn had undertaken his own survey of the ruins, and his proposal, like Wren's, called for mathematically arranged streets laid out on a grid pattern. These streets would be wide, and gardens and plazas scattered throughout the city. Evelyn's design required certain industries to move beyond the city walls, either because they posed a risk of fire or simply because they were disgusting. Charles and James, Duke of York, discussed the plan in great detail, and Evelyn went away convinced that he had won the royal brother's approval. Hooke, as the Royal Society's curator of experiments, presented his plan to the Society and the London Common Council at Gresham College a week after Evelyn had met with the king. Like the other two, this plan demanded that London be rebuilt on a grid. Hook's proposal was approved by the Society and Bloodworth. These were just the three major proposals, but there was no shortage of great thinkers and would-be great thinkers in London in 1666. The mapmaker, Richard Newcourt, proposed another grid system, this one based around rectangular plots with a church in each. Peter Mills, a surveyor for the City of London, drew up a proposal which Bloodworth rejected out of hand. But probably the worst-received plan was drafted and printed by Captain Valentine Knight. Captain Knight proposed a reorganisation of London based around buildings rather than streets, and, this was the kicker, the digging of a grand canal through the city. This canal would be under royal authority and used to transport goods between warehouses and ships on the Thames. Captain Knight suggested, perhaps believing that this was his ace in the hole, that the use of this canal would require paying tolls. This money would give the Crown an annual income of more than £200,000. Now the king might have liked the money, but he was far too politically savvy to take it. Charles ordered Captain Knight arrested for the crime of suggesting that the king might profit from London's misfortune. Knight wasn't imprisoned for long, just enough to make a statement of Charles's sympathy with the city. Now, did you notice the glaring issue? Some clash of interests and priorities. Yes, the security of existing land ownership and any desire to change the pre-fire layout of London were mutually exclusive. Whether it was the limited changes laid out in Charles's declaration to widen streets and reduce alleys, or the grand sweeping reforms imagined by Wren, Evelyn and others, they would require either ignoring existing property rights, which was equivalent to the worst heresy for early modern Englishmen, or compensating existing owners. And who had the money for that? Plus, as nice as these wide boulevards and gentle parks would be, they sounded awfully pricey. Who would pay for all this? The government couldn't afford it, and neither could the city. There was also the question of time. Not only were tens of thousands of people still living in tents and sheds and neighbouring towns, with winter quickly approaching, but the ruins of London were incredibly dangerous. Nearly all the fires in the vaults and cellars had been found and extinguished, but they'd been replaced by gangs of bandits. Muggings, murders and abductions were common, victims left for dead or just dead in one hole or another. Apparently, a favourite method was for travellers to be offered a lamp-lit escort through the rubble, only to be set upon by waiting bandits, bundled underground, robbed, and left in the dark without a light and no idea how to get out. And so, the grand ideas of Wren and Evelyn and even Captain Knight for a modern city of wide streets and beautiful parks crumbled in the face of the reality of cost, convenience, and time. So, what actually happened? On the same day that Wren presented the king with his plans, the Common Council ordered that the streets be cleared, although in many cases this hit the rocks of whether it was the building's owner or its tenants who had to do it. Eventually, the king donated £100 to pay workmen to tidy up the last of it. Owners and occupiers had to provide information about what they owned and where they lived. A special committee of aldermen and city councillors was established to take charge of the building. King Charles made Wren and 2 architects commissioners for rebuilding the City of London, and the Common Council appointed 3 men to be surveyors. One of these was Robert Hooke. The 6 of them were responsible for surveying and rebuilding, and though they did relatively well, the survey was never fully completed. Rebuilding began very quickly, although any building which didn't meet the King's proclamation to be built in brick or stone was ordered pulled down by the Lord Mayor. Any which did were exempt from hearth tax for 7 years. In 1667, with clean-up mostly finished and rebuilding underway, 2 Acts of Parliament were given royal assent on the 8th of February. The Rebuilding of London Act put into law the guidelines laid out by Charles's proclamation. Houses were to be built from brick and stone, and the designs of houses were standardized. Which street they were built on decided which of 4 designs a house could be. Surveyors would monitor the building and ensure everyone was keeping to the restrictions, and anyone who meddled with property boundary markers, for example, moving your neighbours so you got a slightly bigger plot, would be fined, imprisoned, or whipped. Everyone had 3 years to rebuild, with a possible extension of 9 months, but if after that a plot was still empty, the land could be seized and resold to someone who would build on it. The Act also covered how the rebuilding would be supplied and worked. To prevent price gouging or profiteering, 2 judges would set the price of building materials and the wages of workers, and any trained mason or carpenter who came to work on the rebuilding would be awarded the freedom of the city, making them a citizen of London with all the benefits that came with that. Now, in terms of who would pay for all this, as far as both the Crown and the city were concerned, that was on private individuals, but more on that in a moment. For buildings like churches, a new duty was levied on coal imports, 1 shilling per cauldron of coal brought into London. This duty was originally due to expire after 10 years, in 1677, but when the Second Rebuilding Act was passed by Parliament in 1670, it was extended to 1687, as well as doubling to 2 shillings a cauldron. By 1671, most of London's houses had been rebuilt, and the work was nearly finished 3 years after that. The authorities worked hard to enforce the Rebuilding Acts. Throughout the 1670s, the Court of Aldermen summoned dozens of builders and property developers who were accused of ignoring or flouting the standards. There was also a flurry of new orders and regulations for people within the city, ranging from how embers and ashes had to be stored and disposed of to what everyone had to do in the event of another fire. By and large, the reborn City of London emerged from the ashes with a very similar layout, albeit with new brick and stone buildings instead of the old wattle. There were some changes. About 150 streets, important ones like Fleet Street and Cheapside, and forgotten alleys which the great and the good might occasionally pass through, were widened. No buildings were allowed within 40 feet of the Thames and the River Fleet either, and public buildings like the Guildhall and the rebuilt Royal Exchange were given extra space around them. Those who lost out from these changes, whether that was a foot or 2 from their plot, or because they couldn't rebuild at all, were paid damages. But on the topic of money, the second act to receive royal assent on the 8th of February 1667 was the Fire of London Disputes Act. This established the Fire Court, and it was responsible for mediating disputes between owners, tenants, and subtenants. It was exhausting, but highly necessary work. 3/4 of London was occupied by tenants, not direct ownership, and these tenants often sublet. So when most of the city was burned to ash, along with many deeds, working out who owed what to whom was a nightmare. Enter the Fire Court. The court heard its first case on the 27th of February 1667, closed on the 31st of December 1668, and then was reopened by the Second Rebuilding Act in 1670. It finally heard its last case on the 25th of February 1676. Over these 9-ish years, the 22 judges, unpaid, heard 4 petitions a day. They made their decisions quickly, usually on the same day, and rarely granted appeals. Their cases covered around 3,000 of the houses destroyed in the Great Fire, and these were mostly highly complex cases with multiple parties all disputing who had to pay for the rebuilding. The Fire Court cut through these with ruthless efficiency. Before we finish today, the fate of St. Paul's Cathedral is worth lingering on. Christopher Wren had originally been commissioned to repair its steeple, and his commission to repair, rather than rebuild the great church, remained unchanged after the fire. Wren wanted to scrap it, and he bought some time by building a small chapel within the ruins, which the king attended on the anniversary of the fire. But the ruins were unstable, and when it partially collapsed again in April 1666, Wren got his wish. In July 1669, he was commissioned to demolish what was left of St. Paul's and rebuild it in a grand style. As the first cathedral built in England since the Reformation, it had to compete with the greatest churches in Europe, and Wren designed a glorious Baroque structure, which still stands today. Building only began in summer 1675, and within 3 years, the work ground to a halt for lack of money. The coal dues covered most of the cost, but another charity drive only raised a paltry $7,500. Political crises got in the way, with Parliament reluctant to raise taxes for the cathedral. In 1685, 10 years into construction, Parliament granted St. Paul's the right to collect coal duty until 1700. In 1697, the cathedral was complete enough to hold its first service, and in 1711, it was finally finished. Wren certainly kept himself busy over those 36 years, designing, among other things, the Royal Observatory, the Wren Library at Trinity College, Cambridge, and the monument to the Great Fire of London. As we welcome in 2026, I'd like to thank my Patreon House of Lords, which has been joined by Jerome Wilson, Duke of Abercorn, Colin, Earl of Ross, Joseph, Earl of Cherion, Joseph, Earl Stewart, Earl Ando O, Mitch, Earl de Jager, Earl Gabriel, Aaron, Earl Scott, and getting right under the wire just before I finished editing this episode, Mary Jean Andrews has been promoted from the Countess of Cardigan to the Marchioness of Cardigan. They join my existing supporters, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders, Harold, Duke of Hanson, Mason Barney, Marquess of Bedfordshire, and Preston, Earl of Preston. Thank you to all of my patrons who have received this episode and every other episode ad-free. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to find out more. Also, thanks to everyone who's left reviews on Apple Podcasts and comments on Spotify. Thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.